Hi, this is Brent, the climate guru, and we're going to talk a little bit about biodiversity and the Biodiversity Conference that's just took place in Cali, Colombia. What is biodiversity? Biodiversity is all the plants and animals on the planet, their relationship to each other, their genetic biodiversity, and their relationship to the biomes in which they live. There was recently ended the 16th Conference of the Parties, the Biodiversity Conference, that took place in Cali, Colombia. It ended November 1st. 2 years ago, there was a conference in Montreal, and in Montreal, they made certain promises in concept. One was to develop a fund which would be used to preserve natural areas on Earth. A second concept was to include indigenous people in all the conferences pertaining to biodiversity. And another important one was to come up with a plan to monitor biodiversity loss or preservation that different nations engage in. And so those were some of the promises. Another important one was to end the huge $1 trillion subsidies that governments give to fossil fuel companies and other companies that destroy the natural environment. So that was 2022 in Montreal. So what's happened since then? Just last week in Colombia, in Cali, Colombia, the COP16, Concept of the Parties 16, took place. And it was a conference in which they were supposed to come up with specific plans to implement these ideas of the conference in Montreal 2 years ago. They were not successful in coming up with funding and also to provide funds to developing countries so they could preserve their natural areas. That wasn't successful. Doing away with huge subsidies, that was not successful. Subsidies for fossil fuel companies, that was not successful. Another point that was not accomplished was a way to monitor the successes and failures of what different countries promised to do in biodiversity. What were the successes in Cali? And there were some successes. One important one was that indigenous people have a permanent seat at all biodiversity conferences that take place and meetings that take place in the future. That was a very important step. Indigenous people and the lands that they own or control probably preserve in a natural state more land than any other mechanism in the world. So indigenous people and their traditions, their knowledge of natural areas, their connection with natural areas are a very important source of guidance and information on what could be done to preserve and to enhance natural areas. The other thing that was significant that was accomplished was there's a industry by pharmaceuticals and other large corporations to gather genetic data. And with that genetic data, which they gather in poor countries, and they use artificial intelligence to evaluate it, the sequence of genes, for example. And they use that to develop pharmaceuticals. 50% of the pharmaceuticals that we use that are developed by big pharma come from natural plant sources. So these big companies go into these developing poorer countries, many in the tropics, and while they're there, they gather this raw data and they take it back and evaluate it, and they make billions of dollars. This is a huge industry. So there was an agreement reached that those countries from which the data is gathered will share in the profits of this industry. So that's what was gained in COP22. There were some disappointments, but there was significant gains. Now, what is biodiversity? Why do we care about biodiversity? We think of it as something separate from us, separate from humans. But biodiversity is what provides to the planet all the oxygen we breathe, the water we use. It comes from natural places. Oxygen comes from plants, photosynthesis. It also comes from tiny plants in these sunlit layers of the upper ocean, which are called phytoplankton. Phytoplankton actually produces more oxygen than any other plants on Earth. All the water we need to drink for agriculture, where does it come from? It comes from natural areas. Water is filtered in wetlands, in natural land areas, and it's used and it's filtered for the purpose of using it for good purposes and for agriculture, for drinking. Without the natural areas, water that we rely upon, we would not have. Underground aquifers, rivers, lakes, streams, that's what we rely upon. Natural areas provide all the plants and animals from which we relied upon for domestication of animals, for crops. And without that genetic data, we would have a problem because many monocrops fail, and we have to have a basis to preserve other genetic bases for the future. So natural areas are really what we need in order to live as humans. Without natural areas, human beings couldn't survive. We are part of nature, and without nature, we cannot survive as a species, as all other animals cannot survive as a species. We are part of nature, and nature is part of us. We evolved on this planet as other animals did. The planet's 4 billion years old, and first life was 3.5 billion years ago. Single-cell organisms developed in the oceans. Multi-cell organisms developed mainly in the oceans, then on land. And there was a period called the Cambrian explosion, where so much life developed around 500 million, 540 million years ago, because there was an event of great oxygen on the planet that many of these life forms developed, similar to the oxygen we have now. So all the animals that developed then, we are a descendant of those. All the life forms on Earth today are descendant from that period of the Cambrian explosion. And there were actually events in which there were extinctions after 500 million years ago. Mass extinctions that happened about every 100 million years. And those extinctions occurred from natural forces on Earth. Sometimes there was a volcanic eruption, which cooled the Earth, prevented the sun. The Earth froze, the oceans froze, and 90% of species would die. There were also periods of excessive carbon, and the Earth heated. And again, most of the species in the oceans and on land died, more than 90%. It would take tens of millions of years for life to recover. There were 5 mass extinctions. The last one was 65 million years ago in the age of dinosaurs, when a comet asteroid about 10 miles in diameter landed in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And that caused huge disruption of the atmosphere, and it killed all the dinosaurs on Earth 65 million years ago. The only ones to survive were ancestors of today's birds, which are a descendant of dinosaurs. So those are the 5 mass extinctions. But scientists tell us and biologists tell us that we're now in the 6th mass extinction. 6th mass extinction is being caused by human beings. The anthropos means humans, and scientists tell us, biologists tell us that we are causing another mass extinction of life on Earth because of the pressures we're putting on the natural world. And this mass extinction, the 6th, as it unfolds, will happen much more quickly. It will happen in a matter of thousands of years. And we don't know how the Earth will recover if it continues in the direction it does because of the pressures we're putting on natural systems. What natural systems are we talking about, and how have they been affected by human activity? The areas of the natural world are disappearing quickly because of human encroachment, and animals are disappearing quickly. To give you an idea, they did studies the last 10 years, every couple of years, to monitor the amount and the number of animal species. It took all vertebrate, for example. They monitored about 20,000 populations of 5,000 species of vertebrate, mammals, reptiles, fish, and birds, and so on. And they found that all over the world in these populations of vertebrate, that 70% of these monitored populations were declining in size. That's an astounding figure. If you look at the biomass of all of these animals, all vertebrates, for example, on the planet, their numbers have declined by about 50%, which is a shocking number that we're losing wild plants, wild animals very quickly. And a lot of it's occurred just since the 1960s and 1970s. as humans encroach on it. So what causes the loss of species, such as the vertebrate we talked about? Well, one is encroachment on the natural areas in which they live, mainly from agriculture, farming, and animal husbandry. For example, the biggest factor is claiming natural areas, forests, pastures, grasslands, wetlands for farms, and also for our livestock, particularly cattle and production of beef. Encroachment growth because of the agriculture and the ranching is the biggest cause of the loss of natural areas, which results in the loss of species where they live. A second major cause is exploitation, fishing too much in the oceans. For example, fish stocks in the last 100 years have declined rapidly. Fish that we're familiar with, halibut, sharks, swordfish, snapper, they've declined actually 90% in the last 100 years. And the marine mammals have also declined because of loss of habitat. Overfishing, most species of fish are fished at levels that are just above their ability to regenerate and repopulate. So we're overfishing in the oceans. For example, China has 17,000 factory ships that they send around the world and that dredge and trawl and pick up enormous amounts of wild fish in the oceans. Development of the coastal areas also affects the oceans. The oceans absorb 30% of the carbon dioxide that humans emit into the atmosphere from fossil fuels, and it causes the oceans to become acidic. Acidic oceans hold less oxygen, which is necessary for marine life, and it also inhibits the formation of shells in certain organisms, lobsters, clams, mollusks, and so on. As the oceans become more acidic, it affects marine life in a very negative way. The oceans also absorb 93% of the excess heat that humans cause as a result of climate change, of the greenhouse effect. The oceans absorb 93% of the heat that we cause from climate change, and it's an enormous amount of heat. Water absorbs heat much more than land and much more than the air, and it stores heat. If we didn't have the oceans absorbing and storing 93% of the heat, the Earth would be 60 or 70 degrees warmer. It would be uninhabitable for most life forms. To give an idea how much heat is absorbed into the oceans, several atomic bombs of Hiroshima-sized bombs, if several exploded every second, that's the amount of heat that's put in the atmosphere that the oceans absorb. In the last 40 years, it would be 25 billion Hiroshima bombs. And in the last 40 years, that much heat that the oceans have absorbed. So the oceans are in decline for these reasons. And let's look at the land. We've talked about habitat destruction because of expansion of farming. We also have cities that have doubled in size since 1992, urban areas in the world. Another cause of loss of animals on land is overexploitation. Animals are captured. Land animals are overexploited. In the Americas, they're captured for the pet trade. For example, fish, birds, aquatic plants. And in Africa, for example, wild animals are often captured for bushmeat, where they're eaten. Overexploitation in the oceans and on land is another cause of loss of biodiversity. Another cause of loss of biodiversity is invasive species, which are species that hitchhike with human transport, go into an area and devastate the natural plants or animals in that area. They might hitchhike in the builders of ships. They might be found in ground transport systems we have. And when an invasive species comes in, it displaces the natural species that are there. An example would be the pine bark beetle, which has devastated huge stands of forests, pine forests in North America. These forests become drier from climate change, from excess heat. They become weaker. The pine bark beetle now is able to go to areas in the more northern latitudes than they were previously because of climate change. Before, the cold would kill them and the forest would be protected. Now they can go further north because of climate change without dying from cold and devastating forests. That's another cause. The other thing we have to consider is climate change. And climate change is actually becoming the biggest cause of loss of biodiversity because areas dry out, there's floods. And when there's climate change, a species that lives in a certain area, it breeds, it hunts, the climate changes and it can't survive there. So it has to move to another location. For example, let's say a cooler location further north. And it's not always able to do that because of blockages in the natural areas. Obviously, forest fires, wildfires that are taking place in North America, in Australia, and other places also have a devastating effect on the number of wild species, as does drought and floods. So the Earth is under enormous pressure from humans. And to give an idea of the amount of wild animals left on the Earth, let's take all the mammals that exist on the Earth today. Humans, our livestock, domesticated livestock such as cattle and pigs. And then let's consider wild. What percentage of the mammals in terms of mass? 36% of the mass of mammals today are human beings. 60% of the mass of mammals are domesticated mammals, cattle, pigs, other species that we domesticate. And only 4% of the mammals in the world are wild. There's only 4% of wild mammals in the world today, only 4% of all the mammals and all the massive mammals. So that's how much they have declined. What can we do to slow down the extinction of life forms on Earth upon which we are dependent? Now, one thing is to obviously slow down carbon emissions, which affect the heating of the planet, cause many animals to be displaced and changes their biomes. Another thing we can do is to slow down exploitation, excessive fishing, and hunting on land. Another thing that we can do that's very important is to preserve and regenerate natural areas. Natural areas, deforestation, for example, has occurred in many places on the planet. The biggest loss of wildlife has actually occurred in Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And Indonesia, over the last 2 centuries, has seen the largest decline in natural wildlife. In particular, the islands that make up Indonesia are considered one of the biological hotspots of the world. There are 17 countries that are considered biological hotspots. The most important among them is Brazil, which has more than 10%, actually more than 20% of the species of animals and plants that live there. The second one would be Indonesia. Another important one is Australia. Another important one is the United States, which has many species that don't exist in other places and has a large percentage of the biology of the world. Other countries include Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, and other countries that are considered biological hotspots. Mexico is also considered a biological hotspot because it has so many different ecologies, so many different areas where they're unique in climate and in topography, and so many different animals live there. And these countries are under enormous pressure as biological hotspots that have endemic species, which are species that live nowhere else on the planet, and have 10% or more of the species on Earth. In Latin America, biological hotspots are Colombia, where the COP16 took place in Cali, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, that have enormous numbers of species. Deforestation is one of the causes of loss of habitat and loss of species. More than 30 to 40% of the world's forests have been deforested. In Asia, for example, Southeast Asia, and in Indonesia, there are farms that develop palm oil, and they are tens of thousands of acres. They cut down the national forest to put in palm oil plantations, and palm oil is used in most cosmetics, most food, most of the thing we use as consumers. And in the Americas, we have develop palm oil plantations and also soy plantations. The biggest cause of deforestation is the development of pastures and ranges for cattle, for beef cattle. The Amazon rainforest, which is made of 8 different countries, most of it's in Brazil, has been deforested 17%. And that is caused, and mainly from the burning of the forest station to create pasture land for beef cattle. That is the biggest cause of deforestation in the Amazon. And the Amazon is very important, not only because it produces so much oxygen, but because it stores so much carbon dioxide. The amount of carbon dioxide that's stored in the tissue, roots, and soil of the Amazon is perhaps 10 or 15 times the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if the Amazon becomes deforested, we're told 20%, 25%, it could reach a tipping point where the actual climate of the Amazon rainforest changes. There's a process called evapotranspiration, where the leaves of the forest trees emit moisture and maintains the health of the Amazon rainforest. And this moisture also affects rainfall not only in Latin America, but all over the world. What we have to remember is that the natural systems on Earth, the forests, the oceans, are very forgiving, and they help balance the climate of the Earth. They keep it in balance. And we have to preserve and maintain the integrity of the oceans of land. We have to rebuild and reforest areas that have been denigrated on land. We have to plant trees and go back to areas which are more primal forests so we can preserve that. People talk a lot about carbon capture and storage, and it's one of the hot topics that the fossil fuel industry likes to discuss. They say, don't worry about emitting billions and billions of tons of fossil fuels into the atmosphere every year because we're going to be able to develop a carbon capture and storage. The technology for huge operations of carbon capture don't exist. They do that in their greenwashing publicity to say, don't worry, we can keep emitting. We're going to have a technical solution, and that's completely false. But what are the systems that we know about that do preserve carbon and capture and store carbon? It's the oceans. It's the forests. It's the pastures. Those are the natural systems that work very effectively. Seabeds, for example, grass seabeds in the Bahamas, in the Mediterranean. Those plants that grow on the bottom, on the ocean floor, capture enormous amounts of carbon. Mangrove forests, which grow on coastal areas in much of the world, is the most efficient plant that captures and stores carbon. Unfortunately, with coastal development, many mangroves have been knocked down, but there are plans to protect the remaining portions and to replant and protect those. We have to look at the natural systems, which are very forgiving to the mistakes that humans are making by emitting chemicals, fossil fuels, and causing heat of the planet. They help moderate the planet and moderate climate. So the natural systems are what we need to preserve. Now, COP16 was disappointing. They made some progress, but not as much as we hoped. And there are other success stories of preservation of natural systems. One of the things that was discussed was preserving a certain portion of the world for natural system, preserving 30% of the oceans and 30% of land and surfaces by the year 2030. So it's called the 3030 Project. And this was originally advocated by the famous biologist E.O. Wilson. So that was one of the commitments made, but the way to implement it for individual nation states has not had enough follow through. However, and there are some countries that have done well. Australia, for example, has preserved more than 50% of its national boundaries, which are its oceans that are within its national territory, especially in the southern oceans of Australia. California, the state of California, has created marine preserves all the way from its borders with Baja California, Mexico, all the way to Oregon. And this has happened since 2005. It's a huge success story, and where fish are able to regenerate intertidal areas, seabeds, and other species are able to rebound. So preservation of natural areas is key to the preservation of species. In the world today, 8% of the oceans are in preservation areas, and 15% of land areas are in preservation areas. There has to be more. The largest preservation areas are those territories that are populated and controlled by indigenous people.
Wow.
And they are the best stewards of natural areas in the world. There's been other success stories in the Mediterranean, for example. The sea turtles around the world are in decline. There's been a program in the Mediterranean to protect their nesting areas. I met last year in Greece with the Hellenic Research Center in Rhodes, met with their scientists there, Vivian Lizadou, who's a research scientist, and explained how they're protecting the nesting areas of turtles, which return to the places they were born. And there's been a huge increase in nesting areas, good things that are happening, but we need to do more. That's biodiversity. It's the world in which we live, the world in which we depend upon. We think that we're separate from nature, but we're not. We evolved in nature from species that came before us. And it's really for our own survival, other than the beauty of the natural world and the importance of the natural world, for our own survival, we have to protect natural areas and biodiversity of all kinds. Thank you.